Hey guys, welcome back. Robocraft Early Access coverage. This is episode 75. I'm Enigmius, and today we're taking a close look at rotor blades. Now, if you were watching your subscriber feeds yesterday, or you saw on Reddit, I did a little burst fire episode talking about the new rotor blades, showing the little practice, demo bot that I made. And talking about the difficulties that I had just getting it airborne. Specifically, we took a tier 10 rotor blade and we built kind of a cage around it, and then we tried to take it into a practice map and fly around, and it couldn't lift the cage that we had built around it. So we put another tier 10 rotor blade on it, and that's what I showed you guys, was that upgraded version with the two tier 10 rotor blades and a tier 5 just for giggles that we had put on there. And it was flying around, it was doing fine, but it raised a very serious question. Like, if these guys are going to be that hard up to lift such a small number of blocks, what can we really expect out of them in terms of the overall working capacity of them in proper matches? Not just the practice map, but proper matches where people are shooting at you and destroying the stuff that you put on your bot. So I decided to sit down and do some figuring to kind of figure out what was going on. Actually, first of all, there were a couple of different things that I had done, because the Panther Bee, I pulled it apart in part because I needed the tier 10 prisms to finish the Pretty Hate Machine, but also because anticipating these rotor blades, I figured we would rework the entire design anyways, and we would have to start from scratch to do that. So I did one build that was two tier 10 rotors, but they weren't overlapping in any way. They were, spread far enough apart that they were completely distinct. And the idea is I was trying to keep a low profile. If you're looking at the bot from the front, I wanted the lowest possible profile. And because of the size of these things, if you have them stacked in any way, that low profile is just shot to hell immediately. So that's what I tried to do. And you can see here, it was enormous. It was bloody huge. So it didn't take me long to realize that wasn't going to work. I tried a smaller version by allowing that kind of stacking to take place so it wouldn't be so big from front to back. It made for that very large frontal profile, but at the same time, it was a little bit more manageable in terms of the size, but still, just looking at it, you could say, like, this thing is reliant on these two massive rotor blades. The tier 10 rotor blade has less than 16,000 armor, which, to put it in perspective, a tier 10 railgun or plasma cannon can do more than that with a single direct hit. SMGs would have to work a little bit harder, but not a lot harder, just a little bit harder to get one of these things off of there. And then if your bot is reliant on these things, you're grounded. It's game over. It's really a little bit disconcerting when you're talking about trying to build a competitive bot. So I said, okay, well, the only other thing that we can really do is do a comparison between two different sizes of rotor blades to see if maybe there's not something we can't figure out so that we can get equal or better performance within the same amount of space with a little bit more options to configure things, maybe protect things, and just generally come up with something better than what we had. So I decided to sit down and do some comparisons between a tier 10 rotor blade and a tier 5 rotor blade. Now, understanding, obviously, that leaves tier 6, 7, 8, and 9 that we haven't tested. Plenty of other people who have the kind of theory crafting inclinations that want to sit down and do that kind of testing. That's fantastic. I just wanted to do some general testing to get some reasonable numbers, not 100% accurate, but close enough that they're useful. And then I would share that with you guys so that you guys have your own understanding of what's going on. So without trying to make this too much math and blah, but just to illustrate the concept, the first thing I wanted to do was to get a comparison of the size. A tier 10 rotor blade is 19 by 19. I didn't bother checking to see if you can have some overlap in the corners because they're circles and sometimes that's cool, but wasn't really going to change things in this case. So I just working within squares. What kind of square do you have to fit one of these rotor blades inside? So for the tier 10 it was 19 by 19. For the tier 5 it was 11 by 11. It makes a lot easier to compare the actual working size if you go by the surface area. So the top down, just 2D surface area, 361 blocks for the tier 10, 121 for the tier 5. 361 for the tier 10, 121 for the tier 5 means almost exactly 33% the size of a tier 10 rotor blade is the tier 5. So you can in the same surface area, you can have technically 3 tier 5 rotor blades for every 1 tier 10 you have. Obviously, you can't all squish them into the exact same square, but you get the idea. It's just working in terms of the size of the overall bot. 3 tier 5 for the size of a tier 10. But then we have to get right down to the real numbers that matter in terms of what rotor blade can lift how much. So to do a little bit of testing, what I did was I took a tier 10 rotor blade and I built a very simple symmetrical chassis, or mostly symmetrical, with a pilot seat in it, obviously, and then I would take it into the practice match, and then I would try and you know, see if it would lift the chassis. Now, one of the things that I learned that might be a little bit sneaky that you might not even think of is that if you just hold down the spacebar to lift one of these guys with such a simple chassis, it's going to wobble all over the place, and it's going to seem like it's not wanting to lift whatever it is the chassis is made out of. But if you just hold forward as you're holding space, it stabilizes and you get a much better understanding of whether or not it's going to lift what you're trying to lift. So that it was fortunate that I learned that, because from the testing that I was doing, the tier 10 rotor blades didn't want to lift anything stably and predictably until we started moving forward at the same time as we were trying to lift. So that was the testing, is we would go into the practice map with whatever we had. If it lifted and it seemed like it was okay, we'd go back into the garage, add some more blocks, go back to the practice map, test it again. It's a little bit tedious going back and forth until we finally reached a point where, in terms of this test with the tier 10 rotor blade, we had so much weight on the chassis that it would lift for a few seconds and then it would lower again. Like, it didn't want to hold it aloft, it would just kind of lift and then set it back down again. So that, to me, was close enough to the breaking point that I said, okay, well, we're going to record the mass of this guy. And the easiest way to do that is using the garage's cube count to get a count of all of the cubes in that chassis, which was 399 multiplied by the weight of the prisms. After we've removed the cube count for the pilot seat and the rotor, so you don't have to worry about that. What was left, only the prisms that we built the chassis out of. 399 tier 9 prisms at 7 kilograms apiece, 2,793 kilograms, or for the sake of keeping things as simple as possible, 2,800 kilograms lift capacity for the tier 10 rotor blade. Doesn't sound like much, but the game doesn't scale precisely with the kilograms and things the way you might expect it to, so that's fine. Well, we got a number that we can use, 2,800 kilograms. So then we took that same chassis, I put 2 tier 5 rotor blades onto it and removed obviously the tier 10 rotor blade, and then did the same thing, took it into a match. It definitely didn't want to lift that amount that we had on it, so I pulled a bunch of blocks off, put it back into the practice map, tried to lift it, it lifted it, so then we did the same thing, back into the garage, add a few blocks, back into the practice map, until it reached that point where it didn't want to lift. And in this case, it wound up behaving like a fat hover, like it didn't want to lift, but you could still kind of, it was, you know, you could move across the ground, and it wasn't making scraping noises, but at the same time, it wasn't gaining any altitude whatsoever. So we said, okay, we'll call that good enough for the testing. That was 365 blocks, or for the simple math, dividing by 2, because remember we had 2 rotor blades and we're interested in the lifting capacity for one of them, so dividing by 2 is 1,300 kilograms total lifting weight for a single tier 5 rotor blade. So if we kind of put it into the context of comparing the two now, we have the tier 5 rotor blade, which is 1/3 the size of a tier 10 rotor blade and lifting 1,300 kilograms, versus the tier 10 rotor blade that lifts 2,800. Obviously, per rotor blade, the tier 10 comes out on top, but if you then take the tier 5s and say, okay, well, it's 1/3 the surface area, we'll use 3 of them, what do we get? We get 3,900 kilograms lifted instead of 2,800 on the tier 10. So using 3 tier 5 rotor blades, obviously you're not going to fit it into the same 19 by 19 square, because that's not how the surface areas work, but you could, you know, with a little bit of stacking, you could probably make that work not too difficult in the execution. But the point is, you get much better performance out of 3 tier 5s than you do out of a single tier 10. You can reconfigure the tier 5s, put them wherever you want. Easier to protect. If one gets shot off, you're not as bad off as if you get one of the tier 10 rotor blades shot off. They're inexpensive. it was the numbers that I was hoping for, was that we were going to be able to do something with the smaller rotor blades that would give us a little bit more flexibility in terms of the build, so that we don't have this situation where we've got these two giant rotor blades that we're completely reliant on, that are very, very easy to have, you know, shot off, and then we're stuck. We're just basically a big bloated walker that's had to stretch the chassis so thin in order to get around these rotor blades that it's not really all that strong compared to what we normally do. Yada yada yada, etc., etc., etc. So, knowing this with these numbers, next episode we're gonna reinvigorate the whole concept of the Panther Bee with tier 5 rotors, even though it's going to be a tier 10 bot. We're going to do our best to protect the rotors, get some rails on there, get some, walker legs, put ourselves in a position where we can get around and shoot at people and hopefully survive every once in a while, because sometimes those daily bonuses are tough to get in a bot that just blows up all the time. So that's what we're going to do. If you want to be notified when I end that video, you can subscribe to my channel. Of course, you can always follow me on social media. Links for that always in the information section below the video. Please leave your comments and feedback. Thanks for watching, guys, and take care.